Hello, and welcome to You Can Grow Your Own Way, a conversation for parents and carers of neurodivergent children. I feel so privileged you are taking time out of your busy life to learn all about the ways to interpret neurodivergence for you and your child. Remember, all advice on this podcast is general and may not specifically apply to your child, so we encourage you to also talk to your GP, paediatrician or specialist to see if what you've learned will help your family. Hello and welcome to You Can Grow Your Own Way, a conversation for parents and carers of neurodivergent children. I'm joined by Diana today, and she is the creator of the Keywell app. We're going to be discussing parent and carer regulation and co-regulation, an incredibly important topic for being able to sit with your children in their big feelings and help them work their way through it. As you know, I normally do a biography for our speakers, but I'm actually going to let Diana do her own. She has an amazing story of how she got to the point of working and creating the Keywell app, and I think it's best for her to tell it. So, Diana, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited. So my name is Diana. I've got 2 kids, and one of them neurodivergent, formally diagnosed, and the other one not yet, but we know there's something going on underneath there. I'm also diagnosed ADHD. And a few years ago, when I was kind of at the bottom of a dark well, trying to work out what was going on with my son, I just really found that there was no support in terms of accessing a pediatrician or a psychologist when I needed one. There was really very little information that was able to, guide me onto next steps or understanding what was going on. So I decided to do my own thing. And it all started with just writing what was going on, what I was seeing every day on pieces of paper, which, as you can imagine, became quite crazy. I couldn't find where it was and I couldn't see any of the patterns. And, my husband is from a finance background. He's like, let's do an Excel spreadsheet. And so I thought, okay, let's try an Excel spreadsheet. Well, again, didn't quite work because when you're trying to record things, it's, you're not carrying your laptop around. So I used some of my background in developing digital products, and we decided to fund an app. And so the idea of the app was to allow me to, record a lot of the things that I was seeing, in terms of emotions and functioning, sleep, and medication, especially this fear about starting medication, wondering whether things were going to get better or worse or what the impact was. And so I spent quite a lot of time talking to other parents and just working out what they needed, just to make sure that they needed the same thing that I did. And so, that, Keywell came about, this app that allows you to record all these things. But in addition, from a parent's perspective, also just kind of asked you how you were going and how you were interacting with your child, because often we forget how much of our own health and mental well-being and how we react to our children can make things better or worse.
What a beautiful way of describing it. Thank you. And you even left me with a segue, which I am so grateful for, because that's where we sit with regulation and co-regulation. And there are a lot of myths and misconceptions around regulation and co-regulation, which we'll get to in our conversation. Definitely looking forward to breaking those down. But essentially, we're talking about the state that we're in and how we bring that state to the little people that we're trying to help. And you're right, often the carer in that perspective does get neglected, both by ourselves and by those around us, because we're so busy caring for our little people and worrying about our little people. And that's why this discussion is so incredibly important. So jumping literally straight into the deep end.
Sure. I'm in.
What is regulation?
Look, and you're right, there is a bit of misconception about what that means. But the way I see regulation is really about how we deal with stress. right? That's how do we manage stressful situations? Because that's how we are able to match our energy, our physical state to a task, right? Or an activity that we're doing. If we can manage all the different stresses, then it's easy for us to match whatever it is that we're doing, whether it's, when we're excited about a football match that we're going to, or whether it's, the first time that a child is walking to school by themselves and they're nervous. All those feelings are all valid, and they don't always have to be something that dysregulates you. You can use some of this, a little bit of that anxiety walking to school, to be a little bit more aware and just ensure that you don't cross the road. You become a little bit more observant. So I think regulation is really managing stress and matching, how you're feeling and your energy to an activity that you're doing.
And that's perfect, because I think the biggest misconception out there is that regulation means that you need to be calm.
Yes.
And we don't exist in a world where we need to be calm all of the time. It would be, firstly, a really boring world if that was literally what everything did for us. We were just zen 24/7. But also, it's an expectation we don't need to place on our children. And, quite often we see that children are given this perception that they're supposed to actually be able to manage their emotions better than grown adults are, which is completely unrealistic, especially given the tools they have at the time. So understanding that regulation is state dependent, if you're supposed to be excited in that moment, that you feel excited instead of completely overwhelmed, or if you're meant to be sleepy, you feel sleepy rather than overly charged up and overtired and running around the house. So, yeah, that's a beautiful way of explaining it. Thank you. I will share a little moment around regulation that I had this weekend. I had a morning, and I still can't tell you what it was. I do not know what it was. I've been trying to rack my brains to think about why I was in this headspace, but I was just angry. I was just angry. There was no reason why. I just felt angry. And I remember sitting at the breakfast table with my little kidlets around me, and the feeling of like bubbling fury just sitting inside me and being like, this is not going to be helpful. I was snappy. It made my kids be hyper energetic. And I actually said to my husband, I need to go for a walk. Tap out. Like, this is one of those moments where I just need to actually go for a walk, because I knew that my regulation was definitely not matching the state that it was supposed to be in. And, those kinds of things, they have such a bleeding impact on those around us as well, which is, something we'll get to, because we're talking about self-regulation and co-regulation. But sometimes you have those little moments where you're like, oh, this is what happens when I'm not aware of my feelings and my emotions. So, yeah, we're all human.
Yeah, and I was going to say, to expect yourself to be every day, at every moment of the day, regulated, for extended periods of time. I think it's not really going to happen. That, again, back to this idea of perfection, it's impossible, really. So.
Yes, a little step back, listeners. Before we started recording, we were talking about the backdrops in our recording spaces. And Diana was worried about the actually exceptionally organised space behind her. She just has lots of stuff, and that's life. Like, life has lots of stuff. So, we were talking about dropping away that shield of perfection, because it's not realistic. And it can lead to a lot of stress, a lot of unnecessary stress. So we work out how to let those things go. And that probably circles us around to self-regulation. So would you like to talk to us about some self-regulation?
Yeah, I think self-regulation, again, it's something that we have to think about in context of our brains and our age, and the expectation that you can regulate as a 3-year-old or a 7-year-old or a 12-year-old, and then as a 24-year-old or 30-year-old. So all that really changes. So I think just having that baseline of understanding of self-regulation, again, is our ability to manage our own stress and being able to manage and regulate our energy and regulate our emotions. All these things contribute to self-regulation. And so, as you know, even as adults, we might have difficulty self-regulating. So it's, we can't be surprised that a young child can't do that by themselves. So, and I suppose when you think about self-regulation, it's also thinking about, I'm not sure how much you know about executive functions. So executive functions are all the things that our brain does. It's like a little orchestra, and there's, 3 main parts, which is inhibition, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. And all those things are all the thinking bits that help us achieve a goal, any goal. And so when you think about self-regulation, we rely on those 3 things to help us regulate. And that's regulate, our movements. So it can be when we're excited, we might be bouncing up and down. It could be, modulating how we are feeling about something. So that frustration that might be coming through. And so, self-regulation, I think, is actually quite complex. It's not a really simple thing to describe, because it relies on so many different parts to make sure that, we stay regulated and we are able to do that ourselves.
I think the really amazing thing about self-regulation that I've observed, and this is taking it as personal observation, so the brain is phenomenal, and we talk about the brain a lot in this podcast because we're talking about neurodivergence, which sits within the brain. But when we're looking at neural pathways, the more that you use them, you can kind of imagine the wider they become. So if you don't use it very often, if you imagine you've got to walk down a really narrow bush path with lots of trees across the way, and it's going to take you that amount of time to get to where you need to go, the more you use it, the wider it gets, the more friendly it gets for traffic, and suddenly you're driving to where you need to be.
Yeah.
And I think that self-regulation is one of those things that really needs you to work that neural pathway. So there are a lot of people who have probably never self-reflected, and they're not aware of their regulation states. They're not aware of their triggers. They may not use their interoception to feel what's going on within their body, and they actually have to practice it. And I know that in the 5 years I've been a parent of a child who's got neural complexities and needs my help with co-regulating, I've learnt more and more about understanding my own regulated state because I've actually worked on it. I've made sure that I've sat and I've observed it, and I've taken time when I've gotten time to reflect back and go, why do I think that set me off? So my Mr. 8 is a high-pitched screamer. Right? He loves, when he's frustrated, he loves a really high-pitched scream. I grew up in a house full of girls, and it was full of high-pitched screaming. And so the sound of a high-pitched scream actually automatically, I get goosebumps, I go like really rigid, it totally sets me off. I had to sit and observe that response in myself to then be able to go, right, Mr. 8 is screaming, I need to just stand and take some deep breaths and breathe my way through this, because I know it's going to trigger me. I know that it's going to make me respond in a way that I don't want. And that doesn't just happen. I think it's almost a disservice to say to some of the parents and carers we've got here that you can just self-regulate. You can't. You need to, just like any exercise, you need to actually take the time to think about the way you are reacting. And build that muscle to be able to regulate in the moment.
Look, I'll be honest. I really only learned about my own neurodivergence and my own triggers through a lot of hard work. And look, this was part of the whole app thing. It really helped me understand, because I didn't realize that I had auditory sensitivities, meaning sound for me was a big trigger. And often what would happen would, when I would start to bubble over, and almost like it felt like it was a light switch for me, the flipping of the lid. And I found that it was caused when the dog was barking, the TV was on, and the kids were yelling or arguing or whatever. So all these different sounds of different pitches and different volume and coming from different directions really set me off. And I didn't understand that that was the case. And, at 40 something years old, that's when I started to become more aware of how things like sound were actually contributing to my own dysregulation.
And I guess the really amazing part about that is, so I'm going to ask, noise cancelling headphones, loops, flares, what do you use?
I use loops, but I also have the little Apple earpods that you can turn off and on with the sound, so it becomes noise cancelling. And yeah, it's amazing. But it's not even doing that. It's also being aware of the situations when those things happen, right? Yep. I know that in the morning and at the end of the day, it's like the witching hour. So it's at those times that things can really go awry. So knowing that that's when things can happen and when I can also become dysregulated, it's changing and adapting and sort of identifying what kinds of things can I do to make this better? How can I regulate? What do I need to do? Do I need to call upon my husband for these things? Or, do I need to pre-prepare some of these things? Or do I need to give more time to my child because they need connection at this point, or things will just, get out of control? It's just identifying all those times and my own triggers to be able to work through those things.
And once again, a constant recurring theme that we're finding when we talk about this is that, when you have a child who is neurodivergent, it's not actually about fixing them. It's about us finding our ways to not only understand them, but also understand ourselves, and the amount of growth that we each do as a parent or carer when we have a child that has additional needs within ourselves. The more we understand about ourselves is incredible. And it's such an important part of the journey. And really, it's actually an amazing and magical and beautiful part of the journey, because as you were just saying, you found the moments that make you feel really uncomfortable within your own skin. And now you're finding your natural ways of navigating through those, which without the experiences you are having with your child, you may not have come to. So not that, you want to put silver linings or anything, because it sounds really cliched, but I think it's a really important thing to think about, that we actually really do get to know who we are as people better because of the process of being parents of these children. So, and you sort of started to talk there about when your son was going to need more connection and understanding those times. So we've really gone into the window of co-regulation. Yes. Do you want to start talking to us about co-regulation?
Yeah. And so again, co-regulation is something that we've spoken about a lot about parents and kids. And so it's this idea of being able to use your own regulation, right, to bring someone else into a state that's regulated. So they rely on you to be able to kind of move away from this state of feeling, quite intensely, whether it's angry or frustrated, and just kind of bring them back to a state where their body and their energy, it feels good. It feels, can't think of a better word, but calm. But calm, when I mean calm, I mean, again, you feel good. You're not feeling like your body's out of control, or your brain is just got so many racing thoughts that you can't quite, bring it back. So, it's this idea that you use someone else and someone else's regulation to get you to that point. And I was just going to say that if you think about it, we do it as adults as well. Right? It's not just about the parent and the child. We do this as adults. I don't know. I often, when I'm feeling, angry or upset, I'll call my husband. Or if you're in a workplace and you're stressed and there's someone sitting next to you and they're more relaxed, it just, somehow you're able to co-regulate, and nothing more than just sitting next to someone who is regulated can really help.
It's like when you walk into a yoga studio. You've had a really busy day. Your brain might be saying, I don't think I can do yoga this afternoon. Like everything's just feeling spinning and out of control. How am I going to do this? And you walk in and the yoga instructor, who has had an incredibly beautiful day and has been surrounded by gorgeous calming music and lovely fragrances, starts to talk to you. And within a minute, you feel all of that adrenaline just drop. I think there's a really beautiful example of this that's called the Disney hug, and I don't know if you've heard of the Disney hug, but there's a rule if you are one of the characters at Disneyland. Mm-hmm. So if you're dressed up as Belle, they have a rule there that if a child comes over and hugs you, you are not allowed to let go first.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's really sweet.
Isn't it amazing? So you have to wait for the child to let go. And I think that that's a really beautiful example of a co-regulation moment, because you are using all of that gorgeous calm energy within you. In the case of Disneyland, often it's joy and excitement as well, to share with this child until they've felt it enough to be ready to separate.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
I know, it's really great. So simple and so beautiful. And when you see it in action, when you see children start to understand it in action, it's a really powerful thing. Both my boys have very recently started to become aware of how much they need deep pressure hugs when they need some help regulating. And they will actually come over to me and say, Mum, can I have a big squeezy hug?
Yeah.
And they know that they need that feeling from my body. They need that presence around themselves of knowing where they are to bring them back to where they feel comfortable.
I love that. And it's, part of this regulation idea is about relationships. It's about safety, and it's about the environment. So if you have those things, then regulation is so much easier to attain than if you are, in an environment that's dysregulating, or if you are worried about the people that you're with, whether you think you're being judged or people don't like you, or if you feel that if you feel unsafe for some reason, then regulation is just a very far away concept rather than, something that you can manage every day.
So I'm just going to say a little note here. Listen up, teachers and ESs, if any of you are listening. That is an incredibly important point. What the point that you've just made is so fundamental, that co-regulation and regulation is about the safety of a connection, and it's about the relationship. And it's not something that you can do if you don't have rapport with the person who is attempting to help you co-regulate. So you need to create safety in the relationship and the connection for it to work, for that medicine to filter on through.
Yeah, you want to know that someone knows you and cares for you, right? Because if you feel like you're not sure that they have your best interests in mind, then you're not going to feel safe. You're not going to feel like whatever that person's saying actually means something. I recently found something about, I read, I don't know if you know about this, about brain waves and heartbeat synchronicity. Have you heard of that before? So it usually happens when someone is telling a story, or when you're dancing with someone, or you're listening to music together. Your brain waves and your heartbeat start to synchronize.
Oh my goodness.
And so you connect at a much deeper level. And it's so amazing, because they say, if you're going to see, a therapist, and the way that therapy really works is when you're able to connect at that very basic level with someone. So if you're a teacher and you've got all these little kidlets sitting around listening to you, or even, older adolescents, that ability when you have the power to connect and speak, it's just incredible when you know that you have that influence on all these people just based on the conversation and the story that you're telling. It's quite, I love it.
Oh my goodness. I hope someone uses that as an inspiration for an art project. That's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
Like, it's just such a gorgeous thing to think about. I'm visualizing story time at bedtime, and it makes so much sense.
Yes.
You know, when you're reading a book to your child and they're starting to get sleepy and it's part of their bedtime routine, it makes so much sense as to why they actually manage to calm themselves to go to sleep. And it's so fundamental in the routine. So, wow, I love that. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, so think of regulation in that way. Sometimes it's just, or even pre-regulation, you know, keep them regulated before, if it's, you know, we were talking about when we know there's the witching hour, what are the things that you do beforehand to make sure that they're able to get through that unscathed, you know, and you're able to get that through that unscathed. It's kind of almost baking in some time for things that allow for regulation, because, you know, every day your regulation ability is going to be different, right? Depending on what's happening. Some days you're going to be better and you can deal with a lot more, and other days you're going to be able to deal with a lot less. So thinking about each day as a brand new day to make sure that you have, you know, enough petrol in the tank to deal with things is really important.
There's someone that I follow on social media who likes to talk about parenting adventures, and she's very real. And I love the realness of what she does. And at the end of everything, she always says, "Now go and grab a snack." I feel like it's just such a fundamental thing when you're thinking about how you are and how you're connecting and talking about the preparedness, you know, your little tool, your regulation toolkit.
Yeah. Day
to day, we vary. Sometimes we're hungry. And what we need to do is we need to go and get a snack. Sometimes we're tired. It's not always. We don't always have the space to fix tired, unfortunately. We just have to kind of draw adrenaline from somewhere. But once again, working that muscle, listening to those keys and going, okay, how do I prepare for this? I know I need to go and have a muesli bar before I do this, because otherwise I'm not going to be able to face it, and just embracing it.
No, that's so true. That's so true. And I mean, one of the other things that I was thinking about doing the work around our own self-regulation as adults is actually, it can be quite scary for some people, because you have to think back to your own childhood, right? And how was I taught to regulate? How did I see my parents regulating? And that, for some people, can bring up quite a bit of trauma, because they were never taught to self-regulate in that way, you know? So I think be kind to yourself when you're going through this process of understanding and being self-aware, because it can just, you know, unravel some other things that, you know, are a bit harder to manage than just going, I'm going to have a snack. Well, there's some deeper things that you might need to work on.
Oh, most definitely. I mean, the old tale of telling kids to just stop crying. You know, just stop it. Stop crying. You're being silly. Which was classic. It was classic parenting for such a long time. And if you as a parent find yourself saying that and then reflecting and going, why did I say that? Think back. Your mum and dad probably said it to you, or your grandparents said it to you, or someone else used to say it to you, that your feelings in this space aren't valid. Go put them away. Go put them away. And then, it's really hard work to find your own way through that doesn't rely on what you were taught when you were younger.
No, absolutely. And the other thing to think about is like culturally as well. So my background is Portuguese, and, you know, there's a lot of cultural expectations around how children should behave or shouldn't behave. And, you know, as a parent, you start to internalize a lot of the things that you were told or you've heard. And so these external expectations around what your children should and shouldn't be doing puts a lot of stress on me to do things that probably I normally wouldn't do because it's not something that matters to me. But, you know, to these family members, maybe things matter a lot more, and you know you're being judged. And in that in itself can be a trigger that makes it harder for me to regulate, because I'm, you know, in this state of tension of just going, well, what do I do if my child says this? You know, am I going to be judged? I don't know, but it's something that's definitely very relevant for me, and it might be quite relevant for other parents as well.
I think it's exceptionally relevant for parents. I think it falls into the bucket. I mean, we have mum and parent guilt anyway. It just happens. And then when you have a child who has behaviours that aren't deemed to be neurotypical or socially normal, then that just amplifies that you are constantly aware of how their behaviour is going to be viewed by the people around you. And talk about working muscles. Like, it takes such a long time for you to get to a point where you feel like you can actually say, this is just what my child needs right now. And that's not easy. It's really not easy. I mean, I think it took me 3 or 4 years of feeling judged in a playground or in a school or whatever if what I needed to do was bring my child when they were yelling and screaming onto my lap and wrap them in a bear hug. And there will be people who'll be looking at you going, you should smack that child, or you should put that child in the car. And no, that's not what my kid needs. In fact, I personally don't think it's what any kid needs, but that's, you know, everyone has their own way of doing what they do. But for my child, that's not what my child needs. And working through that and getting to the point, and I'm not always at that point, sometimes I avoid social situations because I know that in that space I'm going to feel judged. And that, as you said, will make me dysregulated. And the safest thing for me to do is just not to be in a space like that. I'm not going to be my best self.
And you're not going to be your best self for your child either.
No, exactly.
Right? So if you can't be your best self, I mean, can they?
No. We are their walking, talking role models. And as I often say, we're also their inner voice. So, yeah, if we're not feeling like we can be comfortable for them, then we certainly are not going to expect the best out of them. So, yes. Whew. So prioritising adult self-regulation. This is probably a topic we've been weaving through, but it's a really good one to talk about. So what do you think? Have you got some tips on how you've started to do it, or what are your best methods of being able to make sure that you find some time and some availability, not even necessarily in the day, but in your brain to self-regulate?
Yeah. Look, time is this thing, right, that we always say we don't have enough of. It's just this concept where we're like, oh, but I have to do dinner. I have to do the washing. I've got to pick up and drop kids. I have to do work. There's never really enough time. And it just seems to me that we always tend to prioritize the things outside of ourselves. And I know this is trite, but you can't pour out of an empty cup.
Yes.
You just can't. And often, you know, we don't think what happens beforehand. We only have to deal with what happens after. So after we're dysregulated because we haven't had enough sleep, or we haven't had a snack, or we haven't had all these things, that's when we realize that things have just gone wrong. So in terms of prioritizing ourselves, it is about, have I eaten? Right? Just having regular meals and drinking enough fluids, like just the little tiny basic things should just be something that we are okay to give ourselves, give permission to ourselves to accept that, yeah, I can sit down and have breakfast, or, you know, I can sit down and have 5 minutes and have, you know, a tea or a bicky or something that makes us happy. I mean, for me, self-regulation is also about, you know, listening to music or listening to a podcast or watching funny, you know, animal videos. I've got a, the algorithm knows what I like.
No one can't feel good after watching a duck wearing a hat. Come on.
So it's self-regulation and like how you prioritize yourself. It's the things that make you happy, the things that make your body feel good. Whether you're someone who likes to get up early in the morning for a run, go for it. That's not me, but if that works for you, then do that. Or if you feel like scrolling, for 15 minutes and watching, funny animal videos like I do, then that's actually a really nice way to, give yourself that self-care. So I think self-care is not about massages and, aromatherapy. It's about finding the things that just bring you joy. And so when I think about prioritizing self-care is identifying what brings you joy and just making sure that you take care of your body in terms of you've got enough food, you've got enough water, you've got enough sleep or rest, and then finding those beautiful things that make you happy.
It's such a great explanation, and I'm really glad that you tied that through to self-care, because I think for a lot of us, we're often told that the way to avoid burnout is self-care. And then there is this huge social perception that self-care is having a bubble bath and a glass of wine. And then you go, what do I do if I don't have a bath? Does this mean that I can't do self-care, or I can't afford a massage or a facial, or, these sort of things are out of my reach? How am I going to go and get a massage every fortnight? That's a huge time commitment. And then we get the guilt and the pressure and the stress of not being able to do that. And true self-care is actually just taking the time to look after yourself. Mm-hmm. A thing that, as you mentioned, we are terrible at as a society. We are absolutely terrible at it. We're constantly told to be thinking about other people and also to be showing what we can achieve. Mm-hmm. But all of those things naturally become easier when we actually do the things that our body needs best.
Mm-hmm.
And is that a trip to the doctors to go and get all my vitamin and mineral levels looked at so that I can feel better by taking a vitamin D supplement or whatever it is? Like, all of those things are actually, they're really self-care. Mm-hmm. Getting 8 hours sleep, that's self-care.
And one thing that I find for me self-care is looking at the mental load and spreading it around. So it's engaging my partner in some of that. Like, that's self-care, because it means I'm not taking all the responsibility for, booking, appointments or taking the kids to appointments. Or maybe it's the cooking or thinking about what we're going to cook. So for me, that's also self-care. It's taking away from that mental load, because it means I've got less to carry. And that's looking after myself.
100%. And in the same vein as that, if you've got, let's say you have an NDIS plan that allows for it, or financially you're in a position where you can, getting in a cleaner, because cleaning makes you feel horrible and you're constantly feeling guilty that you don't get to it often enough. Mm-hmm. Or you don't enjoy cooking. And so it's much easier for you to get a meal planning service and have someone drop a box of, everything already organised out the front so that you don't have to think about it and you can take that pressure off your list. And I know that some of these things, there are financial barriers that come to them. Not everybody can access them, and that can be one of the challenges of self-care, that it can feel a little bit, economically skewed. Yes. But where you can, finding those things where you can delegate them, whether it is to your partner or to a friend or to a service outside, so that you can not only, then you've got more energy, as we're constantly talking about, to focus on our children, but we have more energy to focus on ourselves.
Yeah. And you know what? Sometimes it's okay to have breakfast for dinner. Mm-hmm. So again, like, removing some of those demands from ourselves is also self-care, right? I don't have to cook that amazing meal every night with all the different vegetables and proteins and whatever. Actually, you know what? We're going to have baked beans on toast and scrambled eggs.
We did that last night. We did it last night.
Right? So that's, I think, when we think about self-care as being all these different things, and that prioritizes our regulation, because it gives us more time, to be able to do the things that we enjoy and love. So time, back to our initial talking about time, and there's never enough time. It's looking at all those different areas of your life and making sure that, you have less stress in your life.
And I think it's really important to say here as well that is a journey. It's actually funny. We've looped around to an off-air conversation that we were having, and it's actually amazing that it's kind of come back here. But it takes time. And sometimes if I speak about my own journey, I know that when I found out about the diagnosis of the children that were in my care, I wanted to do everything perfect for them. I wanted to make sure, like you just said, that every meal had every level of nutrition in it that I could possibly give them. I wanted to make sure that they were definitely every night going to bed right on time, that they had the best of everything I could do for them, which look, as a high altruistic aim, it's a beautiful target to have, but it's not realistic. And I found that I was spending so much time focusing on that level of perfection that I was stressing myself out. And my kids actually weren't getting the best of me. And so if often they're getting really nutritious meals, and often they're getting really great sleep hygiene, and often you're doing what's best for them, and sometimes the rails come off, like the wheels come off the train, and you have to just flow with the fact that they're in bed at 9 o'clock tonight, or you have to flow with the fact that bacon and eggs actually isn't a bad dinner. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. Yeah. Or even if you've had to resort to picking up Domino's on the way home, it's okay, because you know what? The kids have gotten something that's way more important, and they've gotten you. Mm-hmm. And that's so much more valuable than sunflower seeds and broccoli,
Which they probably wouldn't eat anyway. And then, the whole dinner trying to, well, if you have this, just one bite, but look, it looks like a tree. Isn't it amazing?
Please eat your tiny forest.
Oh, God. It's funny because I wrote a series of articles on parental burnout. And, when looking through all this research, one of the key risk factors to parental burnout is actually perfectionism. I'm just going to let that sit, because I've had to really swallow that really hard pill, because I found myself often, in this state of, dysregulation and also burnout. And yes, ADHD has something to do with it for me, because that's my neurology. But certainly this idea of striving to be perfect, to do it the best, and then admonishing myself because I haven't done that. I have had the breakfast for dinner. So it has been definitely a journey that is still evolving. I'm still finding myself doing and saying things where I'm like, okay, just stop right there. Like, what's the outcome? Who's getting something out of this? Are the right people getting what they need? And then just walking away from it. So yeah, it's definitely a process. It's not easy, especially if you have perfectionist tendencies.
And it comes from a place of love.
Sure.
The instinct comes from a place of love. You want to give the best. And it also comes from a level of social programming as well, and we have to accept that and understand that, because that's something we have to let go when we let go of the perfectionism, is we have to let go of that idea that society is going to see us as perfect as well, which has its own grieving process. I know that for me, so my 3 gorgeous permanent care kids, I knew that they came from a background of trauma. And so my initial instinct was, if I give them everything that they couldn't have, I will be able to fix what they missed out on. The problem was, what I was thinking about was all of those materialistic needs. And really, the thing that my kids missed out on the most, and what they really appreciate the most, is time and connection. And so if we sit and we use that as a filter, I think, with our perfectionism, where we sit and we go, okay, so what, as you said, what is the outcome here? You know, is it going to be increasing my child's well-being? If it is, what's the detriment as well? Like, what's the downside? And if at the end of the day what it's getting is time and connection, then there's no loss. You know, if they have scrambled eggs for dinner and they have a mum who can sit and be present with them while they eat, that's so much better than getting homemade butter chicken.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that.
Oh, such an important conversation. Window of tolerance. Great term. Want to talk to us about window of tolerance?
Yeah, so I guess window of tolerance basically describes, this path that happens every day and how you can just be regulated throughout all your day. And sometimes it gets a bit narrower and sometimes it gets a bit wider, and it changes every day. And it's how well you can travel on that road of regulation before you just fall into one side or the other side of dysregulation. And so the idea is that when you're dysregulated, you might have hyperarousal. And what that means is, you've heard of the fight and flight response, when our brains detect danger. And sometimes we fight, and sometimes we run and we yell, but sometimes we can also just shut down. We freeze. It's, we feel disconnected. We might dissociate, and that's sometimes really hard to pick, right? Because we think, oh, they're just sitting there, they look calm, and really they're not. And so window of regulation just really allows us to understand when we perform at our best and what things push us into dysregulation, whether it's this idea of, fighting and running and just being angry and yelling, or also take us onto another path where we just feel stuck and numb and can't move. So thinking about every day as a road that changes depending on what happens beforehand. So, if you've had a really tough morning, your window of regulation is going to be a lot narrower for the rest of the day, because you've already experienced quite a lot of stress. So your availability and the way you can deal with what's coming is a lot narrower. So understanding for ourselves, but also our kids, what has happened throughout their day at school. Why can't they now do the things that we've asked them to do? Well, they probably are traveling this really narrow road that can quickly bump them off to one side or the other of dysregulation. So
I don't know if your kidlets are the same, but the better the day that the teachers of my children say my kids have had, I know the more they're going to fall apart when they get home.
Yeah.
And look, I'm so proud of them for having that sense of like wanting to do well and achieve and sit still in that moment and focus in that moment and be present. But if one of the teachers goes, oh my God, Mr. Six had the most amazing day. And I'm like, cool, he's going to need a snack in the car and an hour of TV when we get home.
And a big squeezy hug.
Yes, and a big squeezy hug.
Yeah.
And what a beautiful use for your app as well, just to say, because you could be recording that in a diary, but to start to understand those patterns and those trends. But I can totally see why Keywell would be really useful in that way. You'd be able to understand the patterns of behaviour that can actually, help or hinder when it comes to regulation.
Look, honestly, the best part was me just understanding my own feelings and how I was responding, just making myself a little bit more accountable for all those moments, because that's what really helped me become more self-aware. And, back to regulation, co-regulation and self-regulation, we couldn't achieve co-regulation until I started to become a lot more self-aware as to why or how I was dysregulating. So, part of that idea of the app is when you're recording your own child's dysregulation, you have to ask yourself, how was I feeling at that time when I responded? And how did I respond? And then you start to go, wow, I really felt disrespected by that, right? Were they trying to be disrespectful to me? Did I take this to heart when there was nothing to take to heart, because it's not about me? So again, going back to this self-awareness as an adult around the things that trigger you and dysregulate you, that's probably like the biggest benefit for me, is this constant kind of keeping myself on track. Why,
I want to put a text box around like that piece and highlight it, because I think that's just, it's the heart of what we've been talking about right there. And it's so important to understand. And I really love the way that you've summarized that. I think it completely nails it from, a lived experience perspective. And I think if people take one key piece away from the conversation we've had today, it's that you can't co-regulate until you understand yourself and what allows you to be regulated or dysregulated.
I absolutely agree with that. And also, it's okay to give yourself permission to, do all these things that we've spoken about in terms of self-care, right? To be able to get to that regulation is giving yourself permission that you matter and you're important, and you can only be self-regulated when you do all these great things for yourself as well.
And the other thing I want to give everyone permission for is the good enough parent. And I'm going to pop a link in the show notes about the good enough parent, that it's been scientifically studied, and that if you are connected and regulated and aware with your child for 30% of their life, 30%, and that's good enough, not at your best, right? Like if they get good enough of you 30% of the time, your child is going to be healthy, emotionally aware, they're going to do great. So the other thing that goes along with that is if you have a day and you muck it up, it is okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say if they're listening to this podcast, they're probably the kind of parent that are already onto it. They're already doing all the right things. They already want the knowledge. They already know that, they matter in their child's development, and they're doing all the right things already.
That's right. Yep. You've showed up.
Yeah.
What an amazing place to leave this conversation. I am so grateful for your time today and for sharing your insights, giving us a bit of a personal flavour into what your life is like as well. I will also be linking to the Keywell website where you can read all about the app in the show notes too, so you can see everything that Diana's worked on. What a great tool to just have on hand, in the midst of our hectic, chaotic lives where we feel like we're putting out fires all the time. It's right there for us to be able to record our journey, and that's phenomenal. So, thank you so much for being our guest today.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been so lovely to have a chat to you. And I look forward to hearing all the other things that are coming from this podcast, because I'm sure there's.
Be sure to check the show notes on our website for any links and references. You can find us at youcangrowyourownway.podbean.com. And if you found this episode helpful, we would love you to help us get the word out. You can share the podcast, tell a friend, and be sure to click the follow or subscribe button so you can access all our new episodes. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, where we would love to connect with you. You can grow your own way, recognised as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of this place, now known as Australia. We're coming to you from Jabberung, Jawajali and Wadawurrung country, the country of our guest speaker, and from wherever you are listening. We respect the elders of the past and present, and we share our friendship and kindness.